The Galactic Council chamber hummed with that special kind of tension you only get when someone's about to show off their shiny new toy. Admiral Vextalk of the Zephyrian Empire stood at the center of the massive holographic display, but his 4 arms spread wide like he was conducting the universe's most pompous orchestra. His purple scales practically glowed with smug satisfaction. Esteemed members of the Galactic Council, Vextalk announced, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance that made you want to punch him in all 4 of his stupid faces. Today marks a new era in galactic security. The assembled aliens leaned forward in their various forms of seating arrangements. The blob like Gelatari wobbled with anticipation, while the crystalline Quartzians chimed softly in harmonious excitement. Everyone was here for the big show, except for one guy in the back corner who was methodically working his way through a bag of popcorn. That guy was Jake Martinez, humanity's representative to the Galactic Council, and he looked about as impressed as someone watching paint dry on a particularly boring wall. He'd seen this song and dance before. Every few cycles, some species would unveil their game-changing weapon, wave it around like a cosmic measuring stick, and then act surprised when someone else built something bigger. Behold, Vextalk continued, gesturing dramatically to the holographic display that materialized above them, the stellar decimator. The weapon appeared in all its gleaming glory, a sleek, a kilometer-long monstrosity that looked like someone had crossed a cathedral with a torpedo and gave it delusions of grandeur. Energy conduits pulsed along its length like the galaxy's most expensive Christmas decoration. This magnificent creation harnesses the power of collapsed stellar cores, Vextalk bragged, channeling forces that can crack planets like eggs. Jake crunched another handful of popcorn. He'd brought the extra butter kind because if you're going to sit through an alien weapons demonstration, you might as well enjoy yourself. To demonstrate its awesome power, Vextalk announced with the theatrical flair of a carnival barker, "We shall obliterate the dead moon of Zerion Prime." The holographic display switched to show a gray, cratered moon drifting peacefully through space, blissfully unaware it was about to become the universe's most expensive firework. The stellar decimator powered up with a sound like the galaxy's most ominous hum, energy building along its length until it glowed like a very angry star. The blast, when it came, was admittedly impressive. A lance of brilliant energy struck the moon dead center, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the entire satellite cracked like an egg, split apart, and disintegrated into a cloud of rapidly expanding debris. The alien council erupted in appreciative sounds, gasps, warbles, clicks, and what might have been applause if you squinted and used your imagination. Even Jake had to admit it was a decent light show. Magnificent, bellowed the Thugarian ambassador, his massive bulk shaking the floor. Truly, the Zephyrians have outdone themselves. Vextalk's smugness reached critical mass. Indeed. With the stellar decimator, the Zephyrian Empire stands ready to maintain peace and order throughout the galaxy. No force can stand against us. His gaze swept the chamber and landed on Jake, who was still eating popcorn with the enthusiasm of someone watching a mildly entertaining rerun. "I trust," Vextalk said, his voice taking on that special tone reserved for talking down to perceived inferiors, "that our human friends understand the implications of this demonstration?" Jake looked up from his popcorn, chewed thoughtfully for a moment, and shrugged. "Nice laser pointer you got there." The chamber fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop if pins made noise in the vacuum of space, which they don't, but the metaphor stands. Vextalk's 4 eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, sorry," Jake said, not sounding sorry at all. "I mean, congratulations on your very impressive moon exploder. Real cutting-edge stuff. I'm sure it took your best scientists at least, what, a decade? Maybe 2? The insult hung in the air like a bad smell in an elevator. Vextalk's scales darkened to a deeper purple. "Human, perhaps you failed to comprehend what you just witnessed. We have just demonstrated a weapon capable of destroying entire worlds." Jake stood up, brushing popcorn crumbs off his uniform. Yeah, I got that part. Very flashy. Tell you what, give me a week, and I'll see if we can't cook up something that'll make your stellar decimator look like a firecracker. The chamber erupted in alien laughter, the kind of condescending chuckles that said they found the human's confidence adorable in the way you'd find a kitten trying to intimidate a lion. Vextalk smiled with all four corners of his mouth. A week? To build something superior to the culmination of Zephyrian engineering. How wonderfully optimistic. Jake grinned back. Hold my beer and watch this. Jake Martinez walked into Dr. Ruby Kowalski's laboratory like a man carrying news of the apocalypse, which, given Ruby's track record with simple requests, wasn't entirely inaccurate. The lab looked like a tornado had hit an electronics store and decided to redecorate with controlled chaos. Half-finished experiments cluttered every surface, cables snaked across the floor like technological spaghetti, and somewhere in the back, something was making a sound like a dying robot having an existential crisis. Ruby herself stood hunched over a workbench, wielding a soldering iron like a magic wand and muttering what might have been equations or possibly curse words in languages that didn't exist yet. Her wild gray hair stuck out in directions that defied both gravity and common sense, and her lab coat bore the battle scars of 1,000 experiments that had gone either very right or spectacularly wrong. Ruby, Jake called out, we need to talk. Can't talk, Ruby replied without looking up. I'm trying to weaponize coffee makers. Did you know that with the right modifications, a standard brewing unit can generate enough pressure to launch projectiles at roughly 300 meters per second? Jake blinked. Why would you want to weaponize coffee makers? It's for science. Ruby declared as if this explained everything. Which, knowing Ruby, it probably did. Also, I ran out of actual weapons to modify, and Neil bet me I couldn't turn kitchen appliances into instruments of destruction. A muffled whimper emerged from behind a stack of equipment that looked like it belonged in either a laboratory or a medieval torture chamber. Neil Whimpers, Ruby's long-suffering assistant, poked his head up like a prairie dog checking for predators. Dr. Kowalski, Neil said in the trembling voice of a man who'd seen too much, you said you were just going to improve the brewing temperature. You didn't mention anything about projectiles. Details, Neil. Science is about pushing boundaries. Ruby finally looked up from her work, fixing Jake with eyes that held the dangerous gleam of someone who'd stared too long into the abyss of possibility and liked what she saw. Now, what's got you looking like someone stole your lunch money? Jake pulled up a chair that had only a 50-50 chance of being an actual chair rather than some bizarre experiment waiting to happen. The Zephyrians just demonstrated their new superweapon, Planet Cracker. Big, shiny, impressive. Made a moon disappear. Ruby's eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning who'd just discovered that Santa was real and had brought her a rocket launcher. Oh, this is interesting. How big was the moon? About 3,000 kilometers in diameter. They vaporized it with something called a stellar decimator. But stellar decimator? Ruby laughed, a sound that made Neil duck behind his equipment stack. Oh, that's adorable. They're using collapsed stellar cores for power generation. Cute. Very traditional. Very predictable. Jake raised an eyebrow. Predictable? Oh yes. It's the standard approach for Type 2 civilizations who want to overcompensate for having small spacecraft. Ruby grinned wickedly. Brute force application of massive energy sources. No finesse, no elegance, no imagination. Neil's head popped up again. Dr. Kowalski, please tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. Ruby's grin widened. Neil, my nervous little friend, I'm thinking exactly what you think I'm thinking, plus several things that would probably give you nightmares. What are you thinking? Jake asked, though part of him was pretty sure he didn't want to know. Ruby stood up, spreading her arms wide in a gesture that encompassed her entire chaotic domain. I'm thinking that any species that needs to build a kilometer-long weapon to crack a planet is probably compensating for a severe lack of creative thinking. I'm thinking that bigger doesn't always mean better. And I'm thinking. Her voice took on that dangerous tone that made smart people run for cover, that it might be fun to show them how it's really done. Jake felt a familiar sinking sensation. Ruby, please tell me you're not about to do something that'll get us all killed. Jake, my diplomatically minded friend, I am about to do something that will either revolutionize galactic warfare or create a very pretty explosion that'll be visible from several star systems. Possibly both. Neil made a sound like a deflating balloon. Why is it always possibly both with you? Because, Ruby said, already moving toward a whiteboard covered in equations that looked like they'd been written by a caffeinated mathematician having a breakdown. The best science happens at the intersection of genius and insanity. And frankly, I've been getting bored with the genius part lately. She began scribbling furiously on the board, her equations flowing like poetry written in mathematical terror. The thing about stellar cores is that they're powerful, yes, but they're also incredibly inefficient. You're essentially using a sledgehammer to perform surgery. What we need is something more elegant. Elegant how? Jake asked, though he was starting to suspect he already knew the answer. Ruby turned back to them, her eyes practically glowing with inspiration. Jake, have you ever heard of quantum cascade resonance? No, and I'm pretty sure I don't want to. It's a theoretical process where you take advantage of the fundamental frequencies that hold matter together and convince them to let go. Very gently, very thoroughly, very permanently. Neil's voice came out as a squeak. Permanently? Well, the atoms remain intact, Ruby said cheerfully. They just forget how to be in the same place at the same time. It's quite peaceful, really. One moment you're a moon. The next moment you're a cloud of constituent particles wondering where the neighborhood went. Jake rubbed his temples. And you can build something like this? Ruby's grin reached levels that should have been classified as a public safety hazard. Jake, I once built a functioning fusion reactor out of spare microwave parts and a disco ball. I think I can manage to cobble together a little quantum cascade generator. A little one? Well, Ruby said, already heading for the supply closet that Jake was pretty sure violated several laws of physics. Just by existing, it doesn't need to be big. That's the beauty of quantum mechanics. Size is just a suggestion, and I've never been good at following suggestions. Neil emerged from his hiding spot, looking like a man who'd accepted his fate. How long do we have? A week, Jake said. Ruby paused in her rummaging through what sounded like a box of very expensive and very breakable things. A week? Jake, you should have led with that. A week is practically an eternity. I could build 3 quantum cascade generators in a week. Please don't build 3, Neil begged. You're right, Ruby said thoughtfully. 1 should be sufficient. The other 2 would just be showing off. Jake watched Ruby disappear into her supply closet, which seemed to be bigger on the inside than the outside, and wondered if it was too late to find a nice, quiet career in something safe and predictable, like bomb disposal or volcano surfing. From inside the closet came the sound of Ruby singing something that might have been a song or might have been an incantation, but punctuated by the occasional crash of falling equipment. Neil, Jake said quietly, is she always like this? Neil nodded miserably. This is actually her being restrained. You should see her when she gets really excited. From the closet came Ruby's voice, found it. Neil, fire up the particle accelerator. We're going shopping. Jake decided he definitely didn't want to know what Ruby meant by shopping. The Einstein Memorial scrapyard looked exactly like what you'd expect from a place that advertised if it's broken, we've got it. In flickering neon letters. Towering mountains of discarded technology stretched as far as the eye could see, creating a metallic landscape that looked like the aftermath of a particularly violent argument between civilization and entropy. Ruby drove their borrowed hover truck through the maze of debris with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found paradise and was determined to strip mine it for spare parts. Jake gripped the passenger seat and tried not to think about the fact that Ruby had once described her driving style as creatively interpretive. "There," Ruby announced, pointing to a figure emerging from behind a pile of what might once have been a space station, Grease Monkey Pete. The man, the myth, the legend who can identify any piece of junk by its rust pattern. Pete looked exactly like someone who'd spent 40 years turning other people's trash into questionable treasure. His coveralls bore the accumulated stains of 4 decades worth of mechanical fluids, his beard contained what appeared to be a small ecosystem, and his eyes held the gleam of someone who'd seen every broken thing the galaxy had to offer and figured out how to make most of it work again. "Ruby," Pete called out, wiping his hands on a rag that probably hadn't been cleaned since the Carter administration. "What brings you to my little corner of organized chaos? I need another flux capacitor? Because I've got 17 of them, and only 3 are actively radioactive." "Better than that, Pete," Ruby said, climbing out of the truck with the agility of someone half her age and twice as reckless. "But I need to build something that'll make the Zephyrian Empire wet their environmental suits." Pete's grin revealed teeth that had seen better decades. "Weapons project, eh? What's the target?" "Galactic supremacy, universal respect, and the chance to prove that human ingenuity beats alien over-engineering every single time." "Sounds like Tuesday," Pete said cheerfully. "What do you need?" Ruby pulled out a shopping list that looked like it had been written by someone having a fever dream about electronics catalogs. "Let's see, I need quantum field generators, preferably military grade, but civilian will do in a pinch. Resonance amplifiers, at least 6, more if you've got them. Something with a really good power coupling system, maybe from a decommissioned battleship." "Oh, whoa. And do you have any crystalline mattresses that can handle multidimensional energy patterns?" Pete scratched his beard thoughtfully, dislodging what might have been a small wrench. "You're in luck. Had a Regellian dreadnought come through last week. Captain traded the whole thing for a case of Earth whiskey and a promise I wouldn't ask where he got it. The quantum generators are shot, but the resonance equipment should be solid." "Perfect." Ruby clapped her hands together like a child who'd just been told Christmas was coming early. "What about power sources?" "Got a stellar converter from a mining operation that went belly up. Previous owner said it was slightly unstable, but in my experience that just means it's got character." Jake felt obligated to ask, "What kind of unstable are we talking about?" Pete waved dismissively. "Oh, nothing serious. Just has a tendency to occasionally generate more power than it's designed to handle. Creates some pretty light shows, though." Ruby's eyes lit up. "Even better. Controlled instability is the hallmark of really interesting science." "Ruby," Jake said carefully, "maybe we should look for something more predictable?" "Predictable is boring, Jake. Predictable is what the Zephyrians built. We're going for spectacular." Pete led them deeper into the scrapyard, weaving between towers of discarded spacecraft components, obsolete weapons systems, and at least one thing that looked like it might have been a toaster but had grown beyond its original purpose. "Here we go," Pete said, stopping in front of what looked like a metallic Christmas tree that had been hit by lightning and decided it liked the experience. The Regellian Resonance Amplifier Array. 6 units, hardly used, only one previous owner who may or may not have been legally sane. Ruby ran her hands over the equipment with the reverence of an art collector discovering a lost masterpiece. "Oh, Pete, these are beautiful. Look at that crystalline alignment. Those quantum flux channels. The previous owner knew what they were doing. Right up until they tried to use it to open a portal to what they called the disco dimension. Pete added helpfully, never did find out what happened to them. Just left a note saying they'd gone to boogie with the infinite." "Tragic," Ruby said. "Not sounding particularly tragic, but their loss is our gain." They loaded the resonance amplifiers onto the truck with the help of Pete's ancient loading robot. which moved with the arthritic grace of something that had been repaired more times than it had been built. As they worked, Ruby kept up a running commentary on the theoretical applications of their growing collection. The beauty of this approach, she explained to Jake, who was trying to figure out which end of a quantum field generator was supposed to point up, is that we're not trying to overpower their weapon. We're trying to outsmart it. Brute force versus elegant application of physics. And if the elegant application doesn't work, then we'll have a very expensive pile of junk that used to be wherever we pointed it, Ruby said cheerfully, but that's what makes science exciting. Pete emerged from a particularly precarious pile of equipment carrying what looked like a disco ball crossed with a nuclear reactor. Found it. One crystalline matrix guaranteed to handle multidimensional energy patterns or your money back. Pete, Jake said, "That's a disco ball." "That's what makes it so perfect." Ruby exclaimed, "Disco balls are already designed to take concentrated energy and scatter it in complex, multidimensional patterns. All we need to do is modify the fundamental quantum structure, reverse the polarity of the reflective surfaces, and add a few zero-point energy couplers, and we've got ourselves a perfectly functional reality modification device." Jake stared at the disco ball. The disco ball seemed to stare back, its mirrored surface reflecting his growing concern in 1,000 tiny fragments. "You want to build a superweapon using a disco ball?" "Not using," Ruby corrected, featuring. "The disco ball is just the delivery system. The real weapon is the quantum cascade resonance pattern that convinces matter to forget it exists." Pete nodded sagely. "Makes perfect sense to me. Some of my best work has involved disco balls. Did you know they make excellent focal points for tachyon beam arrays?" Jake decided he didn't want to know how Pete had discovered that particular fact. As they loaded the last of their acquisitions onto the truck, Ruby surveyed their haul with the satisfaction of a general reviewing troops before battle. Quantum field generators, resonance amplifiers, power coupling systems, and one suspiciously cheerful disco ball filled the truck bed to overflowing. "Pete," Ruby said, "you've outdone yourself. This collection of beautiful junk is going to change the course of galactic history." Pete tipped his cap, always happy to help humanity stick it to the alien establishment. "Give them hell, Ruby." As they drove back toward the lab, Jake couldn't help but notice that their cargo was making soft humming sounds and occasionally emitting small sparks of what might have been anticipation. "Ruby," he said, "are you absolutely sure this is going to work?" Ruby's grin was visible in the rearview mirror. "Jake, I have no idea if this is going to work, but I guarantee it's going to be interesting." Behind them, the disco ball caught the afternoon sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across the inside of the truck, as if it were already practicing for its moment of cosmic glory. Ruby's laboratory had been transformed from its usual state of organized chaos into what could only be described as a beautiful disaster in progress. Cables snaked across the floor like technological tentacles, connecting equipment that had no business being in the same room together, let alone linked in what Ruby optimistically called a coherent system. The Rigellian resonance amplifiers hummed in harmony with the disco ball, which now occupied the center of the workspace like some kind of glittery technological altar. Quantum field generators surrounded it in a precise hexagonal pattern, each one calibrated to Ruby's specifications and held in place by what appeared to be an alarming amount of duct tape. "Neil," Ruby called out from somewhere beneath a tangle of power coupling cables, "hand me that quantum wrench, would you?" "The blue one, not the red one. The red one opens holes in space-time, and we're not ready for that yet." Neil Wimpers stood frozen in the doorway, clutching a toolbox like it was the last solid thing in a universe gone mad. "Dr. Kowalski, maybe we should talk about this. You know, discuss the theoretical implications before we activate something that might accidentally delete reality." Ruby's head popped up from the cable jungle, her hair even wilder than usual, and her safety goggles slightly askew. "Neil, my perpetually worried friend, where's your sense of scientific adventure?" We're on the verge of the greatest breakthrough in applied physics since someone figured out how to make fire burn upward. That's exactly what I'm worried about. Neil's voice climbed toward frequencies that only dogs and very nervous laboratory assistants could achieve. Last time you had a breakthrough, we had to evacuate 3 city blocks. That was completely different, Ruby protested. That was an accident. This is intentional, which makes it much safer. Jake, who had been watching the proceedings with the resignation of someone who'd already written his will, decided to inject a note of sanity into the conversation. Ruby, maybe Neil has a point. Could you explain exactly what this thing is supposed to do? In words that don't require a physics degree to understand. Ruby emerged completely from her cable nest, brushing dust and possibly small amounts of exotic matter from her lab coat. She gestured grandly at her creation, which looked like something that would result if a mad scientist, a disco enthusiast, and a quantum physicist got together for a really unfortunate collaboration. Gentlemen, she announced, behold the quantum cascade reality adjustment device, Mark I. That's a terrible name, Jake observed. I was going to call it the thing that makes other things not be things anymore, but Neil said that was unprofessional. Neil raised his hand tentatively. Could we maybe go back to that name? It was at least honest about what it does. Ruby waved dismissively. Names don't matter. Does function matters. And this beautiful disaster of questionable engineering is designed to convince the fundamental particles that make up our target that they'd really rather be somewhere else. Somewhere else like where? Jake asked. Well, that's the elegant part, Ruby said, pulling out a napkin covered in equations that looked like they'd been written by someone having a mathematical breakdown. They don't go anywhere specific. They just stop being in the same place at the same time. Very democratic. Very egalitarian. No particle favoritism. Jake studied the napkin, which seemed to be held together by coffee stains and wishful thinking. And you worked all this out on restaurant napkins? And pizza boxes, Ruby added proudly. Some of my best theoretical work has been done on pizza boxes. There's something about grease stains that really helps clarify quantum mechanical principles. Neil approached the device cautiously, like someone approaching a sleeping dragon that might or might not be friendly. Dr. Kowalski, I have to ask, what's the disco ball for? Ruby's face lit up with the joy of someone who'd been waiting for exactly that question. Oh, Neil, the disco ball is the key to the whole system. You see, the quantum cascade effect needs to be distributed evenly across the target's molecular structure. A standard dispersion array would require enormous amounts of computational power to calculate the proper distribution pattern. And disco balls, Ruby said with the satisfaction of someone who'd solved the universe's most important puzzle, are already designed to take concentrated energy and scatter it in complex, multi-dimensional patterns. All I had to do was modify the quantum resonance frequency of the reflective surfaces and add a few zero-point energy couplers. Jake stared at the disco ball, which was now glowing softly and making what sounded suspiciously like disco music played at frequencies only quantum particles could hear. You turned a disco ball into a matter dissolution array. I prefer to think of it as convincing matter to embrace its true quantum nature, Ruby said defensively. It's really quite philosophical when you think about it. The sound of distant laughter drifted through the laboratory's communication system, and Jake realized it was coming from the Galactic Council's monitoring channel. The aliens were watching humanity's adorable attempt to build a superweapon, and they were clearly enjoying the show. Oh look, came Admiral Vextalk's voice, dripping with condescension. The humans are attaching decorative spheres to their... What is that supposed to be? Some kind of art project? More alien laughter filled the lab. Jake felt his jaw clench with the particular kind of irritation that came from being underestimated by people who really should know better. Ruby, he said quietly, please tell me this thing actually works. Ruby looked up from the final calibration she was making to something that looked like it belonged in either a particle accelerator or a very expensive light show. Jake, I have run the calculations 17 times. I have checked and double-checked every quantum mechanical principle involved. I have consulted textbooks, research papers, and that one really useful physics forum where graduate students go to cry about their dissertations. And according to every law of physics I understand, this device should be capable of convincing matter to achieve a state of quantum non-existence across a target area of approximately 50,000 cubic kilometers. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. 50,000 cubic kilometers? Give or take, Ruby said cheerfully. Quantum mechanics is more of an art than a science when you get right down to it. Neil made a sound like a balloon losing air. Dr. Kowalski, are you saying this thing could accidentally delete a small moon? Ruby paused in her calibrations. Well, not accidentally. It would be very intentional. The accident would be if we pointed it at something we didn't mean to delete. From the communication system came more alien commentary. Oh, this is precious. They're actually going to test their little, whatever that is. Should we take bets on how quickly it explodes? Ruby's eyes narrowed with the dangerous focus of someone who'd just been personally challenged by the universe. Gentlemen, she said, her voice taking on that tone that made smart people run for cover, I think it's time to show our galactic neighbors what human engineering really looks like. She reached for what Jake really hoped was the activation switch and not the self-destruct button. Ruby, Neil squeaked, shouldn't we test it on something smaller first? Like maybe a grain of sand? Or a single atom? Ruby's grin reached levels that should have required a permit. Neil, my chronically cautious friend, where's the fun in that? Jake closed his eyes and tried to remember if he'd ever done anything good enough in his life to deserve a quick, painless death. The disco ball began to spin. The demonstration site hummed with the kind of tension you get when several dozen alien species gather to watch what they're convinced will be the galaxy's most expensive failure. The Galactic Council had assembled their finest military observers, their most distinguished scientists, and enough recording equipment to document humanity's humiliation for posterity. Admiral Vextalk stood at the center of the observation platform, his 4 arms crossed in a gesture that radiated smugness across multiple star systems. Around him, the various alien dignitaries whispered among themselves in frequencies that ranged from subsonic rumbles to ultrasonic squeaks, all unified in their anticipation of the coming entertainment. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary entities, Vextalk announced with the theatrical flair of someone who'd been practicing his victory speech. We gather today to witness the humans' attempt to match Zephyrian technological superiority. A ripple of alien laughter swept through the assembly. The Gelatari wobbled with amusement, the Quartzians chimed in harmonious mockery, and somewhere in the back, a species that looked like a cross between a lobster and a filing cabinet clicked disapprovingly. Jake Martinez stood beside Ruby's contraption, which had been transported to the test site with all the dignity of a yard sale refugee being dragged to a black tie event. The Quantum Cascade Reality Adjustment Device Mark I looked even more ridiculous in the harsh light of the alien star, its disco ball centerpiece throwing tiny rainbows across the assembled observers like some kind of cosmic joke waiting for a punchline. Ruby herself was making final adjustments to something that looked like it might have once been a toaster but had clearly moved beyond its original purpose. Her hair had achieved new levels of physicist chic, and her lab coat bore fresh stains from what Jake really hoped were harmless calibration fluids. Neil Wimpers stood as far from the device as the observation platform would allow, but clutching a first aid kit that he'd optimistically labeled Emergency Reality Repair Kit in neat block letters. The target. Me. Vextalk continued, gesturing to the holographic display showing a small asteroid drifting in space about 50,000 kilometers away is a Class M asteroid, approximately 2 kilometers in diameter. We have graciously provided this target so that the humans may demonstrate their quaint, attempted destructive capability. More alien chuckling. Jake felt his diplomatic training warring with his increasingly strong desire to wipe the smug expression off Vextalk's stupid purple face. "Ruby," he said quietly, "please tell me you've got this." Ruby looked up from her adjustments, her safety goggles reflecting the disco ball's gentle glow. "Jake, my diplomatically burdened friend, I have spent the last 6 days convincing a collection of spare parts to violate several fundamental laws of physics. If this doesn't work, we'll have learned something very important about the nature of reality. And if it does work, then we'll have learned something very important about the nature of reality, and also we'll have made a small asteroid forget it exists." Neil's voice carried from his position of optimistic safety. "Dr. Kowalski, are you absolutely sure the targeting system is calibrated correctly?" Ruby glanced at the targeting system, which appeared to consist of a modified telescope duct taped to what might have been a compass and definitely included at least 3 components that were actively violating the warranty terms of their original manufacturers. "Defined correctly," Ruby said cheerfully, pointing at the asteroid and not at, say, the observation platform or that nearby star or anything else we'd prefer to keep existing. Ruby consulted a piece of paper that looked like it had been used as a napkin during several meals and at least one minor explosion. "According to my calculations, we're pointing at the asteroid. Give or take a few degrees of quantum uncertainty." Jake decided he didn't want to know what a few degrees of quantum uncertainty translated to in terms of potential cosmic accidents. Admiral Vextalk had grown tired of waiting for the humans to embarrass themselves. "If the humans are quite ready," he announced, "perhaps they could demonstrate their device, so that we may all return to more important matters." The alien assembly murmured agreement. Jake caught fragments of conversation in various languages, most of which seemed to center around how quickly the human contraption would explode and whether the explosion would be visible from the next star system. "Ruby," Jake said, "it's showtime." Ruby stepped back from her creation, which was now humming with what sounded like barely contained enthusiasm. The disco ball spun slowly in its crystalline housing, casting moving patterns of light that seemed to bend space around them in ways that made Jake's eyes water. "Gentlemen and distinguished alien observers," Ruby announced, her voice carrying across the platform with the confidence of someone who'd either achieved scientific immortality or was about to become a very interesting footnote in the history of things that went spectacularly wrong. "Prepare to witness the practical application of quantum cascade resonance theory." She placed her hand on what Jake really hoped was the activation control and not the coffee machine's brew button, which was located uncomfortably close to several important-looking switches. "Initiating quantum field generation," Ruby called out, and the resonance amplifiers began to glow with increasing intensity. The disco ball's rotation accelerated, and the air around the device began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The alien observers leaned forward with the anticipation of spectators at a particularly promising train wreck. "Stabilization achieved," Ruby announced, consulting readings from instruments that definitely hadn't been designed to measure whatever they were currently measuring. "Targeting systems locked. Cascade resonance building to critical threshold." The humming grew louder, taking on harmonics that seemed to vibrate in dimensions that didn't technically exist. Several of the alien observers began making nervous sounds in their native languages, and Jake noticed that even Admiral Vextalk had taken a small step backward. "Ruby," Neil called out, his voice barely audible over the growing quantum din, "the readings are approaching theoretical maximum." "I know." "What?" Ruby shouted back. Her eyes locked on displays that were showing patterns Jake was pretty sure weren't supposed to exist outside of mathematics textbooks written by people who'd given up on sanity. "It's beautiful." The disco ball was now spinning fast enough to create its own weather system, and the space around it was definitely doing things that space wasn't supposed to do. "Cascade resonance at 90%. Ruby announced, her voice filled with the kind of joy that usually preceded either scientific breakthroughs or evacuation orders. "Initiating quantum dissolution sequence in 3, 2, 1. She pressed the activation button. For a moment, absolutely nothing happened. The disco ball continued its enthusiastic spinning, The resonance amplifiers hummed their quantum lullabies, and the assembled aliens began to chuckle with the satisfaction of beings whose low expectations were being thoroughly met. Admiral Vextalk's smugness reached critical mass. How anticlimactic, he began to say. Perhaps the humans would like to try. Then the universe hiccuped. There was no flash of light, no dramatic explosion, no thunderous roar of cosmic destruction. Instead, there was a sound like reality clearing its throat, followed by a gentle pop that seemed to echo across dimensions that didn't have names yet. The asteroid, which had been drifting peacefully through space for approximately 4 billion years, suddenly achieved a state of quantum enlightenment and decided that existing was more trouble than it was worth. One moment it was there, a perfectly respectable chunk of rock and ice going about its asteroidal business. The next moment it wasn't there, and the space where it had been looked somehow embarrassed about the whole situation. The alien observers fell silent with the kind of silence that happens when the universe does something unexpected, and everyone needs a moment to process what their eyes just told them. Admiral Vextalk's 4 mouths hung open in an expression that would have been comical if it weren't accompanied by the dawning realization that he might have just witnessed something that redefined his understanding of everything. Where, he said slowly, did it go? Ruby consulted her readings with the casual air of someone checking the weather. Oh, it's still there, sort of. The atoms are all perfectly fine, they're just not particularly interested in being in the same place at the same time anymore. Very democratic dissolution. You made it cease to exist? Well, cease to exist is such a negative way to put it, Ruby said thoughtfully. I prefer to think of it as achieving a state of distributed quantum liberation. The asteroid is now free from the tyranny of cohesive molecular structure. The silence stretched across the observation platform like taffy made of stunned disbelief. Somewhere in the back of the assembly, someone dropped what might have been a recording device, and the small clatter echoed like thunder in the absolute quiet. Jake found his voice first. Ruby, he said carefully, what exactly did you just do? Ruby looked up from her instruments, which were displaying readings that probably violated several international treaties regarding the measurement of impossible things. I convinced 2.3 trillion tons of matter to embrace its true quantum nature and achieve oneness with the universal probability matrix. In English, please. I made it go away by asking very nicely. Neil emerged from behind his protective barrier, moving with the cautious steps of someone checking to see if the world was still there. Dr. Kowalski, the power readings just went completely off the charts, then dropped to 0, then displayed what appears to be a small smiley face. That's the quantum field generators saying thank you, Ruby explained helpfully. I programmed them to be polite. Admiral Vextalk finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than the commanding tone he'd been using earlier. That asteroid was 2 kilometers in diameter. Our stellar decimator required full power to destroy a moon half that size. Ruby nodded cheerfully. Yes, brute force approaches tend to be rather inefficient. You were essentially using a sledgehammer to perform surgery. I just convinced the patient that surgery wasn't necessary and maybe it would be happier as a cloud of loosely associated particles. But how? Ruby gestured to her contraption, which was now powering down with what sounded suspiciously like a satisfied sigh. Quantum mechanics, creative engineering, and the therapeutic application of disco balls. Also, I may have accidentally discovered a new fundamental force of nature, but I'll need to run more tests to be sure. The alien assembly began to stir, whispers and murmurs growing into a buzz of confused conversation as the implications of what they'd just witnessed began to sink in. The humans, someone whispered, they made it disappear. With a disco ball, someone else added, because apparently the universe wasn't surreal enough without that particular detail being emphasized. Jake stepped forward, his diplomatic training finally kicking in now that the immediate crisis of potential universal destruction had passed. Admiral Vextalk, he said politely, I believe I mentioned something about making your stellar decimator look like a firecracker? Vextalk's scales had gone from their usual purple to what could only be described as the color of existential confusion. This changes everything, he stammered. The balance of power, the strategic implications. Oh, don't worry about that, Ruby called out cheerfully. I wrote down the instructions. Well, most of them. Some of them are on pizza boxes, but Neil knows where I keep those. Neil made a sound like someone who'd just realized he was responsible for the universe's most dangerous recipe collection. You wrote down the instructions? Vextalk's voice climbed toward frequencies that suggested he was reconsidering several life choices. Of course, Ruby said, as if the alternative would have been absurd. What kind of scientist would I be if I didn't document my work? Though I should mention, some of the measurements are given in units I invented, so you might need a translator. Jake watched the various alien representatives exchange glances that ranged from amazed to terrified to what appeared to be grudging respect. The balance of galactic power had just shifted in a way that no one had quite expected, and humanity had done it with spare parts and a disco ball. Well, Jake said, trying to keep the smugness out of his voice and failing completely, I think that concludes today's demonstration. Any questions? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when several dozen advanced civilizations simultaneously realize they might want to reconsider their assumptions about the species that duct-taped their way to the stars. The aftermath of Ruby's demonstration had transformed the Galactic Council chambers from a place of alien smugness into something resembling a support group for civilizations having existential crises. Admiral Vextalk sat in his chair with the shell-shocked expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of the universe had just been fed through a quantum blender and served back to him with a tiny umbrella. The holographic display still showed the empty space where the asteroid used to be, as if the universe itself was having trouble processing what had happened and kept checking to see if maybe the asteroid would come back if it looked hard enough. Ruby stood at the center of the chamber, fielding questions from alien scientists who seemed torn between scientific fascination and the primal terror that comes from realizing your entire technological civilization might be equivalent to banging rocks together in a cave. But the energy requirements, insisted Dr. Thrall IX of the Andromedans, his crystalline form flickering with confused bioluminescence, but our calculations suggest that quantum cascade dissolution would require the power output of a small star. Ruby consulted what appeared to be a grocery list with equations scribbled in the margins. Oh, you're thinking about it wrong, she said cheerfully. You don't need to overpower the quantum bonds. You just need to convince them they'd rather be somewhere else. It's like the difference between breaking down a door and talking someone into opening it. And the disco ball? This from the Rigelian representative who looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a filing cabinet and given it a PhD in theoretical physics. Optimal energy distribution matrix, Ruby explained, as if this were the most obvious thing in the universe, plus it adds a certain stylistic flair to the whole matter dissolution process. I believe aesthetics are important in proper scientific methodology. Jake watched the alien assembly try to process the fact that their collective military might have just been rendered obsolete by a middle-aged human woman with access to a junkyard pride and an apparent disregard for the conventional limitations of physics. Admiral Vextalk finally found his voice, though it came out significantly smaller than it had been an hour earlier. Dr. Kowalski, he said carefully, what you've built, it's not just a weapon, is it? Ruby tilted her head thoughtfully. Well, that depends on your perspective. From one point of view, it's a highly efficient matter displacement device. From another, it's a practical demonstration of quantum mechanical philosophy. From a third, it's proof that the universe has a sense of humor and enjoys watching civilizations get uppity about their technological achievements. But the destructive potential. Oh, destructive is such a limiting word, Ruby said, waving dismissively. I prefer to think of it as creatively redistributive. The atoms aren't destroyed, they're just relocated to a more metaphysically satisfying state of being. Neil, who had spent the last hour quietly having what appeared to be a philosophical breakdown in the corner, looked up from his emergency flask. "Dr. Kowalski, could you please just once give a straight answer about whether or not your invention could accidentally delete reality?" Ruby considered this with the serious attention it deserved. "Well, Neil, theoretically speaking, if someone were to point it at something really fundamental to the structure of space-time and turn the power up all the way, but that would be terribly irresponsible. The collective intake of breath from several dozen alien species created a sound like the universe's most nervous windstorm. However," Ruby continued brightly, "I've built in several safety features to prevent that sort of thing. The targeting system won't lock onto anything with a gravitational field larger than a small planet. And I've programmed the disco ball to refuse to spin if it detects any probability of universal catastrophe above 12%. 12%? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Well, you have to leave some room for experimental error," Ruby explained reasonably. "Science is all about calculated risks." Admiral Vextalk stood up slowly, his four legs moving with the careful precision of someone who just realized he was standing next to a bomb that could be set off by bad luck and excessive confidence. "Dr. Kowalski," he said formally, "on behalf of the Zephyrian Empire and the Galactic Council, I would like to apologize thus for any previous statements regarding human technological capabilities." Ruby beamed at him. "Oh, that's very sweet of you. No hard feelings. Everyone makes mistakes. Your mistake was just assuming that bigger is always better, and humanity's position in the galactic community." Jake stepped forward, his diplomatic training finally proving useful for something other than avoiding interstellar incidents. "I think," he said carefully, "that humanity would be quite happy to continue our peaceful participation in galactic affairs. We're not interested in conquest or domination. We're just interested in making sure everyone understands that underestimating us is a poor life choice." Ruby nodded enthusiastically. "Plus, I've got at least 17 other projects I'm working on that could probably redefine our understanding of fundamental physics. Did you know I'm trying to weaponize elevator music? Not for any particular reason, just to see if it's possible." The alien assembly exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't any particular device, but rather their apparent inability to leave well enough alone when it came to the laws of physics. "Perhaps," suggested the Andromedan's representative carefully, "humanity would be interested in sharing some of their insights with the broader galactic community." Ruby's eyes lit up with the dangerous gleam of someone who'd just been asked to teach a masterclass in creative destruction. "Oh, I'd love to. I've been working on this theoretical framework for convincing gravity that it's optional. Very preliminary work, but the applications could be fascinating." Neil made a sound like a deflating balloon. "Please don't give them ideas, Dr. Kowalski." "Too late," Ruby said cheerfully. "I've already got the plans sketched out. They're on the back of a pizza box in my lab, right next to my notes on temporal mechanics and that grocery list that might accidentally be the key to faster-than-light communication." Jake watched the various alien representatives try to process this information and saw the exact moment when they collectively realized that humanity wasn't just dangerous because of what they'd built, but because of what they might build next. Admiral Vextalk cleared all four of his throats. "Perhaps," he said diplomatically, "the Galactic Council should consider establishing a new classification for human technological achievements. Something along the lines of approach with extreme caution and possibly a safe distance of several star systems." Ruby looked pleased. "That's very flattering. Though you might want to make it several dozen star systems. Some of my experiments have been known to have unexpected range." As the alien assembly began to file out, muttering among themselves in languages that probably didn't have words for the kind of respectful terror they were experiencing, Jake found himself standing next to Ruby and her contraption, which was still humming softly and occasionally emitting small sparkles of what might have been residual satisfaction. Ruby, he said quietly, did we just accidentally take over the galaxy? Ruby considered this thoughtfully. Well, not taken over, exactly. More like convinced everyone else that maybe they should ask nicely before assuming we're pushovers. And the disco ball. Ruby patted the now dormant sphere affectionately. The disco ball has achieved its destiny as the most fabulous instrument of cosmic persuasion in the known universe. I'm thinking of giving it a medal. Jake looked out at the stars visible through the chamber's transparent walls and wondered what other impossible things were waiting to be built by humans who'd never learned that certain things were supposed to be impossible. So what's next? Ruby's grin reached levels that should have required permits from the local physics department. Well, I've been thinking about that elevator music weaponization project. Also, I had this idea about convincing time to flow backwards, but just on weekends. And there's this fascinating theoretical possibility involving the practical applications of weaponized bureaucracy. Jake decided he was going to need a very strong drink and possibly a new career in something safe and predictable, like volcano surfing or professional bomb disposal. But as he watched the last of the alien representatives hurry away with the kind of haste usually reserved for evacuating disaster zones, he couldn't help but smile. Humanity had just earned its place among the stars, not through conquest or diplomian, but by proving that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to build something so magnificently ridiculous that reality itself stops to applaud. And if that wasn't the most human solution possible, Jake didn't know what was. The disco ball gave one final, satisfied sparkle, and somewhere in the distance the universe chuckled softly to itself.